comes chapter 19. All right? Please, at any time, if you don't understand or if you want to add something, interrupt me and ask your question. If not, we can wait till the end of the lecture. All right? Everybody got that? Say yes,
Yep.
somebody.
Yes.
Good,
Yep.
thanks. You got to talk to me, all right? All right, here we go. All right. Blood. If you took AP1, you know that blood is a liquid connective tissue consisting of cells surrounded by a liquid matrix known as plasma. If you put blood that you've drawn from someone's arm and spin it down in a centrifuge, you see this in a test tube. You see plasma. Here's plasma. The majority of blood is plasma. It's liquid. The remainder settles down to the bottom because it has weight. It's red blood cells. It's red blood cells. So 55% of your blood is basically plasma. There are many things in plasma. We'll talk about them individually. And 45% of your blood is red cells. Red cells. There is, in the middle between the plasma and the red cells, we know it as the Buffy coat. You can almost think of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Okay? Because it's blood. But the Buffy coat contains two important items. It contains white blood cells and platelets. Now, we're going to talk about everything. We're going to talk about what's in plasma. We're going to talk about the function of the red cells. And we're going to talk about the Buffy coat. The cellular components of your blood, which are known as the formed elements, include the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and platelets. I want to show you that there's a caveat here. Red blood cells are cells. White blood cells are cells. Platelets are not cells. We will talk about the difference later on in this lecture. The plasma portion of your blood consists basically of water, proteins, and other solutes. We will talk about those solutes. That's important. This is a very important slide. So important that I probably will take 10 questions from it and ask it on exam number 1. I don't care if you know that whole blood is 8% of your total body weight. That's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. But what I do want you to know is that blood plasma is 55% of your blood. You saw that in the centrifuge tube. Blood plasma is basically water, 91.5% water. In that blood plasma, there are also proteins. And those proteins are albumin, globulin, and fibrinogen. Those are the 3 most important of the plasma proteins. Let's talk about the plasma proteins. Albumin. Albumin is the most abundant plasma protein. I'm going to ask you that question. I don't care if you know it contains 54% of the proteins. I want you to know it's the most abundant. And I want you to know its function. Albumin, its function is to maintain your blood pressure. The next plasma protein are globulins. Globulins are involved in cellular immunity. We will talk about globulins in chapter 22, which will also be on your exam, number 1. This is why I added chapter 22 to the hematology lecture. Chapter 22 is lymphatic system and immunity, and globulins are the protein that are involved in immunity. And we'll talk a lot about immunity. Fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is the third most common protein in your plasma, and fibrinogen is important in clotting. How do you stop from bleeding? You add the protein fibrinogen. Without it, you have problems bleeding. So no albumin, globulin, and fibrinogen. And it also has other things in it. It has electrolytes, nutrients, gases. We'll talk about all of those things. Let's go down to the formed elements. The formed elements. 45% of your blood is formed elements. Platelets, white cells, and red cells. Okay? I want you to look at the numbers in this column right here. In this column right here. There are 150,000 to 400,000 platelets in this tube of blood. There are 5,000 to 10,000 red cells in a microscopic section of blood. And there are between 4.8 and 5.4 million red cells. So when I ask the question on exam number 1, and I say, and you have 4 choices, what is the most abundant cell in the formed elements of the blood? What is the answer?
Red blood cells.
Red blood cells. In the millions. Okay? Now, the white cells are divided into categories. And we'll talk about each one of these. They're called neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. Obviously, the most abundant and the least abundant. How do you remember the most abundant to the least abundant? Well, in medicine, we learn mnemonics to remember almost everything. And the mnemonic to remember the most abundant white cell to the least abundant white cell is never let monkeys eat bananas. Never let monkeys eat bananas. Neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. Everybody got that mnemonic?
What was it again?
Never let monkeys eat bananas. From the most abundant to the least abundant. I'm going to ask you that question in some fashion on exam number 1. Okay, I'm either going to ask you the most abundant white cell or the least abundant white cell. So if you know, never let monkeys eat bananas, you'll know the answer. That makes sense?
Yes, thank you.
Good. This is what a blood smear looks like. Okay? What is the most abundant cell on this micrograph?
Red blood cell.
Red blood cell.
There you go. Red blood cells. They're in the millions. They're in the millions. So don't forget that. Don't forget that. Okay? On Thursday, not only will we talk about PowerPoint assignments, we're also going to talk about blood smears. And it's going to be a chance for you to understand what a blood smear looks like. It'll be the lab section of this class for the hematology. Okay? So that's important. That's important. Okay? We'll talk about this blood smear more on Thursday than we are talking about it now. But the majority of these cells are red cells. There are white cells. Here's a white cell. Here's a white cell. Here's a white cell. They happen to be different white cells, but we'll talk about the difference later in this lecture. And here are platelets. These are platelets. These little smudges are platelets. Okay? I want to re-emphasize that platelets are not cells. They are fragments of cells. All right? So what is actually the function of blood? Well, the main function is transportation. It transports oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, hormones, heat, and waste. It regulates homeostasis of all body fluids, the pH of your blood, your body temperature, and the water content of cells. It also protects you from excess loss of blood by clotting. It also protects you from infections. And that's the function of the white cells. And that's extremely important to understand. Here is a chart that really kind of says what I've already said about water and plasma proteins. But you can certainly look at it and understand it a lot better from this chart. But I told you I would talk about the other solutes that are in plasma. This is a picture of blood plasma. You have water and you have your plasma proteins. But there are other solutes. There are hundreds of electrolytes. And the main ones are as you see. The main ones are as you see: sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, phosphate, sulfate, and carbonate. Those are the majority of electrolytes that are in your blood. And their function is to maintain osmotic pressure. Okay? But when we talk about osmotic pressure, we talk about albumin. That's what we talk about, albumin. And these plasma proteins are made in the liver. Made in the liver. That is extremely important. Extremely important. The gases that are in your blood, well, the three big ones: oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. Okay? Oxygen and carbon dioxide are certainly important in life of a cell and also the regulation of the pH of the cell. Nitrogen is unimportant because we don't know what it does. We don't know what it really does. All right? There are other regulatory substances, enzymes, hormones, vitamins. We will talk about hormones and vitamins when we talk about nutrition and the endocrine system. You don't really have to know that. There is one enzyme you have to know, and that enzyme is carbonic anhydrase. And I think that there is a slide coming up that really talks about carbonic anhydrase. So I will hold off until I see that slide. Okay? And then there are waste products, and the waste products are all there: urea, uric acid, creatine, creatinine, bilirubin, and ammonia. These are all products of protein metabolism. Okay? So know the waste products also. How long do these things live? Well, lymphocytes can live for years. Lymphocytes can live for years. Red cells, however, have a lifespan that is much shorter than years, and we'll talk about that lifespan in a minute. Whenever you see things in bold black letters, please focus on it. The word hematopoiesis is the process of producing blood cells. All blood cells come from stem cells. And this slide, busy as it might be, is a very important slide. It will show you where all of your red cells and white cells and platelets come from. Let's look at the red cell. The mother of all red cells is the proerythroblast. Whenever you see the word blast, it means it's an immature cell. You should never see a blast cell in the peripheral blood smear, ever. It means you have leukemia. So when you see a blast cell in the peripheral blood, it is known as leukemia. A proerythroblast will give rise to a reticulocyte. What is a reticulocyte? A reticulocyte is the precursor of an erythrocyte. It is an erythrocyte with a nucleus. The function of an erythrocyte is to transport gases, transport oxygen, transport carbon dioxide. It doesn't need a nucleus. It doesn't need a Golgi apparatus. It doesn't need to produce proteins. All it needs to do is transport gas. So an erythrocyte is a reticulocyte without a nucleus. Okay? What about a megakaryoblast? A megakaryoblast is the precursor of a megakaryocyte. A megakaryocyte is the precursor of platelets. This is a cell. This is a cell. It breaks down into fragments called platelets. And we will certainly talk about platelets, because without platelets, you cannot clot. So the megakaryocyte breaks down into hundreds of thousands of platelets. These platelets are not cells. They are fragments of cells.
So people with hemophilia have like a lack of platelets?
No, they do not. I don't want to take the thunder away from the students that are going to lecture on hemophilia A, but it's a different kind of clotting disease. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. If you look at the list of PowerPoint assignments, there is a platelet abnormality, and that platelet abnormality is idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura, also known as ITP. Okay, that's the platelet abnormality. When I gave out the PowerPoint assignments, I tried to cover all of the different kinds of disorders of the blood and the immune system. Okay, I didn't pick AIDS for a reason because I'm going to lecture to you on AIDS. Okay, that makes sense?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go into the white cells. Let's go into the white cells. The myeloid basically means white cell. Okay? The myeloid stem cell produces all but one white cell. It produces the eosinophil. It produces the basophil. It produces the neutrophil, and it produces the monocyte. And they all come from blasts. Eosinophilic myoblast produces the eosinophil. Basophilic myoblast produces a basophil. A myoblast produces the neutrophil. A monoblast produces the monocyte. So these all stem from this one cell, the myeloid stem cell. The lymphocytes do not come from the myeloid stem cell. They come from the lymphoid stem cell. And the lymphoid stem cell produces lymphoblasts. And there are three lymphoblasts: the T lymphoblast, the B lymphoblast, and the NK lymphoblast. Those are natural killers lymphoblasts. The T lymphoblast produces the T cell, which is a T lymphocyte. You'll learn in chapter 22 that this T means thymus. Whoop. Go back. Okay, it means thymus. The B lymphocyte produces the B cell. You'll learn that the B lymphocyte is born in the bone marrow. They are both born in the bone marrow. The B lymphocyte matures in the bone marrow. The T lymphocyte matures in the thymus gland. Okay? The B lymphocyte becomes a plasma cell. We will talk about plasma cells when we talk about chapter 22, immunity, okay? And there is a disease of the plasma cells called multiple myeloma, which we will certainly talk about. The NK lymphocyte produces the natural killer cell, okay? To jump a little ahead of chapter 22, the T lymphocyte and the B lymphocyte are very specific in their immunity. The NK cell, or the natural killer lymphocyte, is non-specific. This kills everything. This kills everything. These do not. These do not. Very specific, very specific. Okay? Any questions about anything before we continue?
So the lymphoid stem cells are all like the cells that fight off diseases and stuff like that?
They all do. Not
They all
only
do.
the lymphoids, no, the lymphoid stem cells are in immunity. Immunity. They have what's known as memory. The other white cells, from the myeloid stem cell have no memory. That makes sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Let me give you an example. You step on a nail. You pull the nail out. 2 days later, you have a red inflamed foot because now you have an infection. What's going to be there to fight that infection is this white cell, the neutrophil. It comes immediately. And then the monocyte comes after the neutrophils. There are no lymphocytes there, none. But these two cells, the neutrophil and the monocyte, will fight off infection. Okay? That makes sense?
Yes.
Okay, now let's go into another type of infection.
Professor,
Yes,
I have a question.
yeah.
So for the natural killer cells, you said that they like kill everything. So would that be like similar to like a chemo type thing where it doesn't attack like any specific infection, it just kind of attacks like quick growing cells?
It's there all the time. It will actually come to that foot that's infected also.
Okay.
Okay? But most lymphocytes have memory. The natural killer cell does not have memory, but the T lymphocyte and the B lymphocyte have memory. Okay? Let me put it to you this way. I don't want to get into chapter 22 in any great detail, but since you asked the question, I will try and help you understand. You're exposed to someone who has COVID-19. The COVID-19 virus gets in your system. The lymphocytes attack COVID-19 and kill it, because you're 19, 20 years old. All you get is a cold. All you get is a cold. The lymphocytes then have memory antibodies towards COVID-19, so that when you go out again and you're exposed to COVID-19, you don't get it, because the memory lymphocytes say, wait a minute, I've already killed this disease. Let's go kill it before it starts to give you symptoms again. That makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Unlike when you step on a nail, okay? It's not specific. It's not specific because there's no memory involved. Okay? All right. Okay, I hope none of you are falling asleep. Red blood cells. Red blood cells are also called erythrocytes. They contain the protein hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the protein that carries oxygen to cells. And some hemoglobin will take carbon dioxide away. Okay? Each hemoglobin molecule contains the basic mineral iron. That iron allows each molecule to bind to 4 oxygen molecules. So when I ask a question on exam number 1 and I say, what mineral is involved in the carrying of oxygen in the body? The answer is iron. Okay? Red blood cells, as I showed you, have no nucleus because their only function is to carry oxygen to the cell. They don't need to make a protein. They don't need to have a memory. They need to transport gases. And that's what they do. That's what they do. Okay? Here's what they look like: a biconcave disc. Here they are. Here they are. Here's hemoglobin. Here's hemoglobin. Okay? Remember, it's a protein. It's a protein. So it's made up of polypeptide chains. And the mineral that carries the oxygen is ferrous, iron. There it is, right there. There it is. It is what carries the oxygen. It's also, hemoglobin is also involved in regulating your blood pressure to a minor degree. To a minor degree. They focus on this, and it's really garbage. There's no reason to worry about nitric oxide. Does anybody know what nitric oxide really does? Anyone ever hear of Viagra? No, you're all dead, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What is Viagra used for? Viagra is used for erectile dysfunction. What Viagra really does, it stimulates the blood to produce nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a neurotransmitter that causes the blood going to the male organ to increase. That's known as vasodilation. When you vasodilate the blood going into the male organ, it will become erect. So that's the function of nitric oxide. Not only does it do that to the male organ, it also does that all over the body. Okay? If you vasodilate your arteries and your veins, it will enhance blood flow and will enhance oxygen delivery. Okay? The thing that I want you to know on this slide is the enzyme, and there it is in big black letters, carbonic anhydrase. There is a very important formula in the body, and that formula is H2O, water, plus CO2, carbon dioxide, will give you carbonic acid. H2O plus CO2 will give you H2CO3. And that formula is catalyzed by this enzyme, carbonic acid. Carbonic anhydrase. That is the enzyme that catalyzes CO2 plus H2O to give you carbonic acid. This is the basis of the pH of your blood. Okay? This is the basis. Here it is. CO2 plus H2O gives you carbonic acid. It is catalyzed by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. And that's very, very important. Carbonic acid transports about 70% of the carbon dioxide in the plasma. You'll learn that in the respiratory lecture. Don't worry about that now. Know the enzyme, know the formula. Know the formula. CO2 plus H2O gives you carbonic acid caused by the catalyzation of carbonic anhydrase. Both ways. It works both ways. That's the enzyme involved in red cells. Another important thing you have to know is the life of the red blood cell. It's 120 days. is 4 months. Why is that important? Why is that important? Who cares if red blood cells only last for 120 days? Has anybody ever given blood?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, you have. You have. Okay? And they usually tell you, thank you very much for giving blood, but you can't give any more blood for 120 days because you've got to build back up your red cells. So that's why it's very important. These dead red cells that die are removed from the circulation by two very important organs. One is the spleen and one is the liver. The breakdown products are recycled and reused. And this slide, which is another important slide, shows you that when the red cells die, they break up into protein. Remember, hemoglobin. Here's the heme part. Here's the globin part. The globin part is protein. When you break down protein, you get amino acids. When you get amino acids, the body uses them to make more protein. The heme part is where the iron comes from. It's where the iron comes from. Here it is. There's the iron. Notice that it is 3 plus. So it's now called ferric iron, not ferrous iron. There is a protein that will transfer this iron into the liver. It's called transferrin. It's called transferrin. It gets into the liver, and the liver makes from this right here, it makes ferritin. Ferritin then goes into bone because bone needs iron. Bone needs iron. And why do bones need iron? Because where do you think red cells are made? They're made in your bone marrow. They're made in your bone marrow. So you need to have iron plus globin to make red cells. There are also other things involved to make red cells. Vitamin B12 is involved to make red cells. I'm going to give you 3 lectures on Thursday on macrocytic anemias, and that includes B12. That includes B12. We will talk about a very important hormone called erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is made in the kidneys, but it stimulates the bone marrow to make more red cells. So to make red cells, you need iron, you need globin, you need B12, and you need erythropoietin. And there are other things you need too, but these are the majority of the things you need right here. Okay? And we'll talk about those hormones and vitamins, some today and some on Thursday. Now, there is also waste when it comes to heme. And that waste is known as bilirubin. You don't have to know biliverdin. Biliverdin, by the way, is green. The word verdin means green, is green. But what you should know is bilirubin, because bilirubin is a byproduct of destroyed red cells that will land in the liver and in the gallbladder, which you'll learn about in the digestive system. It's a waste. It is a waste. And bilirubin from the liver and gallbladder will eventually go into the small intestine, will eventually go into the large intestine, and will eventually leave in the feces. Why is feces brown? Feces are brown because of bilirubin. Ooh, I'm going to ask you that question eventually, probably in the digestive system, but I'm going to ask that question. Okay? You excrete waste through your GI tract. You also excrete waste through your urinary system. And in the urinary system, bilirubin is converted to urobilinogen, which becomes urobilin, which is in your urine. That's why your urine is yellow. All because of bilirubin. Your feces are brown, your urine is yellow because of bilirubin. That is what we're talking about here. Okay? And red cells last for 120 days. There you go. Any questions on the destruction of red cells? Onward. Erythropoiesis, the production of red cells, begins in the bone marrow. To produce red cells, you need the hormone erythropoietin. It's released by the kidneys. If you are hypoxic, you have a low oxygen concentration. Let's say you have severe pneumonia, you have COVID pneumonia, you need supplemental oxygen. Before you get that supplemental oxygen, your body knows that your tissues are starving. Your tissues are starving from low oxygen levels. How do we make your cells respond to higher oxygen levels without giving you oxygen? You make more red cells to carry more oxygen. And when you become hypoxic, a low oxygen concentration, your kidney will produce the hormone erythropoietin. It's known as EPO, erythropoietin. And I accept EPO as a answer on your exam if I ask the question. All right? It will make your bone marrow produce red cells. And what happens, how do we know you're producing more red cells? Well, what you see in the blood smear of a person who is making more red cells because they're hypoxic, you see reticulocytes. Remember, these are immature red blood cells. They have a nucleus. They will enter the circulation. The normal reticulocyte count is below 1%. When you see in a normal blood smear 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% reticulocytes, you know that person is dealing with hypoxia. Okay? So the reticulocytes will appear in your blood stream. All right? Make sense?
Yes.
You can watch the animation at your leisure. And this is just what we talked about. We talked about how things happen. Okay, talking about hypoxia and erythropoietin. We're sort of saying the same thing here. Let's talk about white cells, and then I'm getting tired of talking, so we'll stop after the talking about white blood cells. White blood cells are called leukocytes. Leukocytes, unlike red cells contain a nucleus and contain organelles, but they don't transport oxygen, so they have no hemoglobin. There are two types of classification of leukocytes: granular, containing vesicles that appear to be stained in their plasma, okay? Eosinophils have granules that are red. Eosin means red. Basophils have granules that are blue. Baso means blue. And neutrophils have granules that are both pink and blue. So the granular leukocytes are neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. The others are agranular. They contain no granules in their plasma. And the agranular leukocytes are lymphocytes and monocytes. Here is a neutrophil. It has both pink and blue granules. Here is an eosinophil. It has red granules. Here is a basophil. It has blue granules. Here is a lymphocyte. It has no granules. And here is a monocyte that also has no granules. Okay? Notice the size. Notice the size. The lymphocyte is the smallest. The monocyte is the biggest. White blood cells can live for months. Lymphocytes can live for years. Their main function is infection control. They combat invaders, viruses, bacteria, fungi. They try and kill them. During an invasion, many white cells will leave the bloodstream and collect at sites of invasion. This process is called emigration or diapedesis. We use the term immigration, actually. Diapedesis is an old term. But that's why when you step on a nail, you get all the signs of infection. You get swelling, you get heat, you get redness, and you get pain because the white cells have left the bloodstream to kill the bacteria that was on that nail. So the 4 signs of infection, which we'll talk about again in chapter 22, are heat, redness, swelling, and pain. Those are the 4 signs of infection. Okay? And this is what happens. They leave the bloodstream. They go into the tissue. They go into the tissue. They emigrate. They emigrate. All right? Think of this as a wall. I hate to use that analogy. Think of this as a wall, and the white cells are climbing the wall and getting into the infection. All right? In general, an elevation in the white cell count indicates infection or inflammation. Now, you don't have to know normal white counts, but the normal white count is between 5 and 10,000. Okay? So if you draw someone's blood who has a fever and their white count is 21,000, you know they have an infection. But if their white count is 130,000, they not necessarily may have an infection. That might be a sign of leukemia. So there's a difference here. There's a difference. A low white count is meaningless. I'll never ask you a question about a low white count. The question is going to be a high white count. Okay? And the differential, which is neutrophils, lymphocytes, basophils, monocytes, and eosinophils, that's the differential white count, will show you the problem. Will show you the problem. And here is what we're talking about. Neutrophils. Neutrophils kill bacteria. You can also get a high neutrophil count if you're burned, or if you're stressed, or if you have any kind of inflammation. Do not worry about low counts. That's not important at the moment, okay? Lymphocytes. Lymphocytes fight viruses. Their lymphocyte count would be increased with viruses, also with leukemias, and also with the disease infectious mononucleosis, which I think I'm going to lecture on chapter 22. All right? Monocytes. Monocytes attack fungi and viruses. So you have a high white count when you have a virus or a fungus. Okay? Eosinophils. Eosinophils are very high in two important diseases. One is allergic reactions and one are parasites. So if you're attacked by a parasite or you have an allergic reaction, your eosinophil count will be high. Basophils will be high also in allergic reactions and in some cases of leukemia. Do not worry about low counts. Worry about high counts. Okay? Let me just talk to you about platelets. Actually, you know what? Let's not talk about platelets. Let's end this. Well, let's end this for right now. And we can talk about some of your questions, okay? I am going to stop the recording. I will post again. I will